Hi, I'm Alexander Russo with The Grade. I'm here with Stephen Wilson, and we are talking about his book, The Lost Decade. I'm so excited to be with you. Before we get started, let me tell you a tiny bit about myself. You and I somehow have never met or don't recall it. I started out as a teacher, then became a policy nerd and worked on the Hill for a while, wrote about education, including about a charter school network called Green Dot. You're probably more familiar with than I am. And then for the last 10 years or so, I've been writing and thinking about education media, how schools are depicted in the media, and whether the journalism and the journalists I know and love are being helpful to the cause of improved education and a upward leaning society. And that's what The Grade is. And what else can I tell you? I am currently obsessed with two things. One is getting back on the soccer field. I'm a high school soccer player trying to get back there. And second of all, I'm obsessed with a TV show on Netflix called Adolescence.
Yes.
Which is about social media and schools a little bit. I interviewed one of the actors in the show. And so that's a little bit about me. Stephen, we're all here to learn about you. Tell us about yourself and about your book.
But Alexander, I want to hear about that show. I haven't watched it yet, but I've been meaning to. But I suspect it's a pretty heavy experience, right? So it'll have to be when I'm in the right frame of mind. So I've been working in school policy for 30, let's not even go there, 30 plus years. And I began my work in Massachusetts, actually, where I'm from, working for Governor Bill Weld when we passed and shaped the 1993 Education Reform Act. So that's my kind of pivotal experience. And then I've been working on the charter side of charter networks, starting and running charter school networks, but also writing about education. So I kind of go back and forth between the practitioner side, which is sort of the main me, and then reflecting on the experiences in writing. And I've just come out with a new book, as you know, that I'm very excited about called The Lost Decade, which looks at where we are in this education reform moment.
Excellent. And tell us tell us about your aspirations or hobbies, and tell us about your favorite TV show right now.
All right. Well, let's see. My favorite hobbies are actually restoring my Victorian house. I guess that's not an unusual one, but I find that to be thrilling. I love doing that kind of work. I love both the physical dimension and the aesthetic dimension. And it's very hard to be playing around with tools and thinking about work at the same time. So it gets my mind off everything else. And I love going to the gym. That's the other thing I find to be very centering. Favorite TV shows of the moment. That's a very easy one for me because I'm obsessed with a particular show called The Pit. I know I'm not alone in that. You know about this show?
This is the one with the young guy from ER who's not so young anymore.
Not so young anymore. He has that kind of middle-aged, dented up kind of manner and look, which I can relate to. But it's absolutely riveting. And so while it depicts one night in an emergency room in inner city Baltimore, and so it is a in many ways a frightening experience. It is for some reason deeply uplifting. And it is because you are seeing such competence on the part of the doctors and nurses and everyone involved in running this ER. So someone called it competence porn, which I just love as a term. And it so fits the moment when we're going after civil servant workers and government employees, and we're trashing them. And here you see people who are just doing great stuff under enormous duress and succeeding. And it makes me also think of education, because I think of our urban school systems that fail the majority of students versus this emergency room experience, which can't fail. And so it's made me think a lot about the connections between those two things.
That's fascinating. It makes me want to see a school's version of The Pit. Wouldn't that be a great TV show to have?
Only if it were a very good school.
Of course, it would have to be. Before we jump into the book and your experiences, and if you don't mind, a couple of mine that came up for me when I was reading the book, I wanted to, just because it's Friday and the Supreme Court deliberated about charter schools, something you know much better than I do. I wanted to see if you had a take, however preliminary, about this issue of religious charter schools. If this happens, which it sounds like it's going to happen, is it going to mean that we're going to have a lot fewer charter schools out there? If people close down their programs, does it mean we're going to have a lot of religious charter schools, which would be objectionable to some and not an issue to others? What's your, again, very preliminary take on the real world impact of this Oklahoma case?
Yeah, well, I'm no court reader, but my concern is, and it's not unusual, right, is that this ruling will end up harming charter schools greatly because we've already lost the degree of bipartisan support, which was not nothing during the early decades of charter schools. And my worry is that if religious schools are permitted, we're going to see a continuing or accelerating pulling away of democratic and liberal support for charters. They will no longer be seen as public institutions, maybe not even conceived legally as public institutions. And many of the advantages that they need as public institutions, such as access to public buildings, access to federal dollars, the pension systems in some jurisdictions, could fall away. So particularly in blue states like Massachusetts and New York, I think this could have a profoundly negative effect. But it's something that we need to understand better.
I hope that's not the case, but thank you for sharing preliminary thoughts. Okay, I want to tell you a quick little story about something that happened to me in the summer of 2020 that I think will connect with some of the things that you have experienced and that you describe in your book. Oh, before we get started, can we see the book?
Of course. I happen to have a copy.
I've got a PDF of it. I'm printing things out because that's the only way I get any reading done. But it's great to see the real thing in the hands of the real live author.
Yes, and you really need the physical copy. Sorry to be old-fashioned, but I will send you one.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. Thank you. Okay, so in June of 2020, I did something that I'd done several times before as part of this endeavor to help journalism and education journalists reflect on their own practice, which was I did what I called a newsroom diversity survey, which is that I asked everyone to tell me what percentage of their editorial staff identified as non-white in whatever form they identified. And I'd done this for the last few years because it seemed like there was a issue or a concern that too many of us were white, not first generation, not in any way economically disadvantaged, and that there was a gulf between the journalists covering schools and the people inside of the schools. So I did this thing as part of my efforts to be a skunk at the garden party. And over the years, I'd slowly gotten more and more newsrooms and more editors to give me their numbers. This is something that's an issue in journalism writ large, and I was imitating something that had been done for many years about journalism writ large. So in June, I wrote up the story of the 5th annual Newsroom Diversity Survey by The Grade. And the folks at the Poynter Institute, which is a journalism organization and a magazine, said that they wanted to publish it. And then I ran into an unexpected and unpleasant, but interesting, looking back at it 5 years ago, an interesting experience, which is that some of the journalists who were mentioned in the piece, in the beginning of the piece, objected strenuously to being included in the piece. They had all announced on social media or by email, they had all announced that they were leaving their education positions to do something else. They were leaving the beat, or they were leaving journalism writ large. And so I, presuming that anything that was on social media was fair game, public information, I included them as in a lamentation about losing non-white journalists that we needed so badly at just the wrong time. They didn't see it this way. They let their displeasure be known publicly and privately to me. Poynter ended up asking me to correct the piece, and I did. And the next week after that, I wrote Mea Culpa about how I didn't understand the sensitivities of non-white journalists in a very difficult industry at a very difficult moment. And so that's the story that came up for me when I was reading your book and thinking about you. Could you tell a little bit about what happened to you for those of us who don't know or haven't read the book yet?
Sure. So, in a nutshell, I had started a charter school network called Ascend Learning, and it was in about its 10th year. And what we did is that we operated, by that point, 15 schools in some of the most impoverished neighborhoods of central Brooklyn. So, for New Yorkers, it's Bushwick and Brownsville and East Flatbush and so on. And we did so many things wrong along the way. But by that point, we had figured a lot out, and we had started to close and even reverse the achievement gaps that are so prevalent in urban education. So in our schools, our Black and brown students were outperforming white students statewide, and we were also closing the economic gap, which is harder. So it was a very thrilling time. I wrote a blog piece. I wrote occasionally about little essays, and I wrote one about intellectual curiosity, and how and this is a topic very dear to my heart, which is that we need to think of great education as something which stimulates curiosity, because curiosity is that great fuel that can drive education forward. And there was a particular employee who was unhappy with what I wrote, and it then created a kind of brouhaha, and I ended up leaving Ascend. So that's the short version of it. And it led me to think about the broader scene in education. I was very curious to know if what I had experienced was something that was happening elsewhere in other school networks. And I found out that, in fact, it was, that this was a much broader phenomenon. That's really the subject of the book, how we turned away from a academic education where the North Star in the classroom of these high-performing charter networks, I should stress that many others were higher performing than mine, and how we turned away from the North Star of great teaching. How can every period provide children a great instructional moment, to the North Star being anti-racism as defined perhaps by Ibram Kendi or Robin DiAngelo? And my book is really about that turning away.
I know the book isn't just about you and your experience, and I know also that you're limited in what you can say. But I'm going to ask you a little bit about it anyway, and you can tell me what you can tell me and not tell me what you can't tell me. I lost a bunch of followers from what happened to me. I got a few calls from funders saying that they were concerned and asking me what I was likely to do. I went through an enormous amount of turmoil. Again, this is a much smaller endeavor than running a school system. In the end, was able to move on. I apologized and publicly and individually, and was able to move on. What can you tell us about what happened to you, and what are the limitations on what you can or want to talk about?
Well, I can say that I think that this was a very difficult moment. It was 2019, and then came, of course, the racial reckoning. And it was a hyper-charged moment. And I think people were, as is typical in these kinds of processes, people are angry, people are scared to speak out. Many people came to me in private and said, fully support you, but I can't say anything in public. Mm-hmm. But you're absolutely right, Alexander. I am limited in what I can, unfortunately, talk about. But it's unfortunate, and yet it's also not, because it's really not what concerns me the most now, which is not my own personal experience. I've had 5 years to think about it. Of course, I was very angry. for a period, but I went on to start another nonprofit, which was a wonderful way of turning the page. Um, and I've also learned so much from this experience, both for myself and for my own leadership, if you will, and perspective. But also, I hope to contribute something meaningfully to how we think about school reform and its next chapter.
Reading the book, I kept thinking, worrying a little bit on your behalf that you might have put yourself back into the wood chipper. Because if I understand you correctly, which I may not, but if I understand you correctly, you're saying that high-performing charter schools have gone in a very, very bad direction, that a lot of people have experienced, been pushed aside unnecessarily or unwarrantedly, that DEI has essentially, or CRT has actually gone too far, unless you're being lawyerly about it. Do you want to, or fear, or both, generating this kind of controversy again?
Not at all. I mean, quite honestly, I've experienced the dial set to 100. So if it recurs at 80, I feel like I have a thick skin. Look, school reform is a fight, and I think that we no longer think of it that way, but it is. And I'm actually urging a return to that conception. Hence the subtitle of the book, Returning to the Fight for Better Schools in America. I think they're entrenched interests that have blocked better schools for decades. And I think there are also a lot of bad ideas in education. And this is one of them. And so I think it's important to speak out. I think where we lost momentum is where we thought that we had to speak in platitudes, in anodyne terms. And I think that actually harmed us. We need to be clear. This is a crisis. We cannot make good on the promise of America unless we have radically better public schools for children from marginalized communities. And that means schools that are far more academically effective than suburban schools. You know, people say we need to have schools that are as good as suburban schools for the middle class. No, we have to have schools that are so much better if they're going to be powerful enough to free students from disadvantage. So no, I'm not concerned about that.
Okay. And then I often feel like Charlie Brown trying to kick the football. And if you're familiar with the cartoon or the meme, at this point we might call it a meme, Charlie Brown keeps trying to kick the football, and Lucy keeps pulling it back, and he is covered in shame and frustration. It sounds like you're not worried about that at all, but I do have to ask, it sounds like you actually still believe in charter schools. And when I was reading the book, I realized, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to say this, but I realized that I had somewhere along the line, long ago, lost hope. You still think, just to be clear, you still think that there's a role, an important catalytic role for charter schools in improving education for American kids?
Alexander, absolutely. My greatest fear is that we subject ourselves to the faddism of education and we say, oh, turn the page, it'll be something new, it's flipped classrooms, it's grit, it's whatever, and we'll move on to the next thing, many of which are quite foolish, instead of recognizing that urban charters are a markedly different kind of success. If you look at Brookings' analysis of charters, so of course, left-leaning liberal outfit, or Stanford's Credo, they both come to the same conclusion, that this is perhaps the most effective, most powerful reform in American education in a half century or more. So we cannot give up on it. We must recommit to it because it is that singular, that powerful, and we must not turn away from it. So when I talk about schools and networks that have been gone the wrong way. It is only some. Others that retained their commitment to academic excellence, like
Mhm.
the Classical Network in New York, or Great Hearts Academy in Texas, or Success Academy in New York City, they continue to turn out 80, 90% of students are proficient. Well, never mind test scores. What that means is that those students are on the path to college and career. And so we know this works. We've figured it out, and we simply need to get back to it and to do it at a much larger scale. So, yes, I feel very passionately about that.
I certainly understand. I also know that we all have been sold stories over the years. Sold a story in this context refers, of course, to teachers being told that they could make kids great readers without sort of a structured phonics instruction. I at times feel like I was sold a story about journalism and the power of journalism. There are a lot of myths that we all have, and it sounds like you are pretty convinced that this is that the charter schools sometimes seem like a myth to me.
Well, I would love if
The
Tim
leeway.
is here, how great to get into that and what causes you to be skeptical. And I say that with great respect.
Well, no,
I
there
feel
was
like there are a lot of myths that pull in the other direction to lead people to think that it's not real. And I think we can one by one dismantle those concerns.
Okay. Well, and you do it, and you do in the book. I remain unconvinced, but you do in the book.
Oh
Part
no.
of this, part of this is also that I just finished reading Noliwe Rooks's book about school integration, and
Mhm.
there's another approach to remedying the inequality and inefficiency of the education, inadequacy of the education that so many kids have received. She's reconsidering. She and
Mhm.
many others are reconsidering that approach. And so maybe I've been infected by the reconsideration virus, and maybe others will be convinced, and eventually maybe I will be. I want to read. You write so beautifully. Can I read a
Thank
couple
you.
of sections
Oh,
uh,
please.
from because I just want people who are watching this and who haven't yet read the book, I want them to understand what you're talking about. This is page 275, which is towards the end. Uh, the entire charter ecosystem will rise up from its defensive crouch. The philanthropic community, think tanks, advocacy, and support organizations, politicians, and clergy will once again celebrate the achievement of the reform sector and urge them on. They will not tolerate this once in decades achievement, one with the promise to remake American education, to atrophy, and to be forgotten in our broken and divided times. They will again defend the sector's record and fight efforts to deny new charters and weaken enabling laws. Together, they will reclaim the cause of social justice. I didn't consult with you about this ahead of time, but that's the place where I thought, okay, this is where we're supposed to be going here. Is that as good a section for that as anywhere else?
Yeah, I mean, I think the last sentence is what I would really like to emphasize is that all of us who were doing this work thought we were doing social justice. And still to this day, I'm quite certain that we were trying in that direction. So, what I write about in the book is the rise of social justice education, which is focused on something very different from academic education. And so, my point in the book, in part, is that if we really want to empower students, which is the ostensible purpose of social justice education, there is no shortcut. We must equip students with the skills and the knowledge to be able to make their way into the world with the toolkit of reasoning, of strong expression orally and in writing, of the ability to analyze, to do math. These are the tools of power. And I think that we mock students when we say we are empowering them, but we actually are denying them those tools, which is what is happening in social justice education. We are
Right.
claiming to empower them, but children are smart. Children are smart. They know when they're being condescended to, and that's condescension, not education. If we really want to educate and empower, we need to equip them with a vigorous, vibrant education. So I want to go back to that.
And part of what we need to do, and I think the book does this better than any other attempt I had ever seen, is to describe the chaos and conformity of the last 5 or 10 years in the urban charter network. For folks who haven't read the book, how many of the top 10 high-performing charter networks have gone through this upheaval similar to the one at your network? I don't know if this is a story that I knew as thoroughly before I read the book as I did afterwards.
Well, I think, to be honest, Alexander, I think we need a lot more research on that question. I don't have the answer. It's very hard to tell how pervasive this is. I think this is the work of the academic community to find out more. But if I were to hazard a guess, I would say it's about 30 or 40% that have been afflicted to varying degrees. The particular case studies that I give are probably the more extreme examples. I think those stories in the book are quite searing to read. They require a very strong stomach to read because you see great work being undone. But there are other networks that were not, where these forces were held at bay or didn't strike, and they continue to go on relatively untouched. I think of the Brooks schools in Boston, which are by far the highest performing charters. The similar pattern, the founders and co-CEOs of that incredible network just said, no, we're a liberal arts school system. Of course, we're going to stick to those commitments. They saw the illiberalism of the anti-racist doctrine as being fundamentally incompatible with the liberal arts commitment. The liberal arts commitment says that we expose students to multiple viewpoints, we have vigorous debate, truth is contested. Illiberalism says there was one right way to think and we're going to force it down your throat. And they said, we're not doing that.
Can we just name? Can we just name check? KIPP is in there. KIPP is mentioned. Achievement First is mentioned. Building Excellent Schools isn't a charter network, but is a reform organization. That, frankly, was the most heart-wrenching of the stories that you told. Are there other well-known brand names that are on the list in the case studies that the people?
Yeah, they were more than I could fit. I think another one that would be important to mention is the Noble network of high schools in Chicago, which had occupied several of the city's top high school slots. The city had a quality review system, and Noble had 3 or 4 of those top 10 positions. And between 2019 and 2024, the period that I looked at, you just saw the results plummet. And the results that I was looking at was the average SAT scores, because it's a high school charter network, which is really quite unusual, and of course is the hardest work of all. So that'd be another example of a network that, it was a tough place. I don't want to be unclear. It was a network that took students out of educational failure, out of a failed system, namely Chicago Public Schools, and had really 2 years before the students would sit for the SAT to turn around educational performance. So it was rough, but it did it, and it helped a lot of kids. And so during this period of turmoil, it adopted a position as being an anti-racist network, and they undid a lot of their practices. Discipline collapsed, fights broke out, academic results collapsed, students were unhappy. It was a dismantling. Now, it may well be that they're putting it all back together. I dearly hope so. But that would be another example of a particularly searing tale.
Looking back, as you've done, I've done a little bit of this, and I wanted to ask you, did you have a sense, looking back well before 2019, when this happened to you, or 2020 when a very small thing happened to me, when I look back, I've written some case studies about the school reform era. I think of the failure of Waiting for Superman
Mm-hmm.
as an example of a mistake and a turning point at a large scale. The whole idea that Davis Guggenheim would make himself a main character in a story about charter schools and public education just blew my mind then, and blew my mind when I went back and looked at it. There's also, I mentioned this to you before when we talked briefly on the phone, there was also this moment in David Simon's New Orleans HBO television show where one of the characters, seemingly out of nowhere, breaks out into a rap mocking Teach for America, mm-hmm. and blaming Teach for America for the displacement of thousands of traditional educators in New Orleans. Looking back, was there a moment before the most recent era, before 5 years ago or 5 or 6 years ago, were there moments where you think, oh, I noticed something there, whether or not you did anything? Were there earlier moments for you?
Well, I think that, so first of all, I just want to agree with you that Waiting for Superman was the peak of what I talk about in the book as this kind of charter school triumphalism, right? Mm-hmm. Where you'd go to conferences and people would talk about what heroes, everybody there who were primarily white, of course, who were starting these networks or involved in these networks. Look, that is nothing that we should be proud of. But at the same time, I understand the exuberance, and I don't think the exuberance was unwarranted. And I think the exuberance was justified later by the results at many of these places. Look, if you go to a KIPP school, and this is not just my pulling data out of nowhere, this is the RAND study of KIPP that found that if you, as a student, as a Black student, attended a KIPP middle school and a KIPP high school in succession, your chances of not just enrolling in a four-year college, but completing four-year college, which of course is a life-changing trajectory event, were now essentially equal to that of a white student. So this is an astonishing achievement. So while that Waiting for Superman period is cringy from today's perspective, it's not crazy that people got excited. So now, in terms of what did we see earlier on about what came to be? Sure, I mean, look, universities were becoming illiberal places. So a lot of these colleges and universities, especially top-tier ones, where sort of TFA-style teachers were acculturated, were learning a particular way of thinking about the world that is rather one-sided. And that they then brought to them when they came to the charter community.
But for you personally, which you described the move towards social justice education. I don't know if we should put quotes around that or not, and anti-racist education. But for you personally, whether it was at a conference or at a board meeting or talking to a new teacher, were there any moments that for you personally, at the time or looking back, you thought, oh, this was a tidal wave coming that I didn't see?
Well, I'll mention a couple just super briefly. One was interviewing a potential leader of our first high school, and we were having a discussion about the liberal arts high school we hope to achieve. And the candidate was talking about a social justice high school. So it led to a discussion, would it be okay if a graduate decided to become a great doctor? And the candidate took the position, no, the graduate must be an activist. Otherwise, they are not a legitimate graduate and human being. And that, to me, really drove home a real mission difference. Another instance was when I was sitting with the diversity, equity, inclusion consultant that we had brought into Ascend, and she was describing the steering committee that she wanted to form. A very nice person, by the way. And she was talking about the representation. We must have diversity in terms of rank in the organization, race and ethnicity, and so on. And I said, and of course, ideological diversity. And she said, no, we must have only true believers. And I thought, there we are.
Wow, those are
Yeah.
vivid examples. And are those 2012,
No,
2015?
well, the first one is probably 2016, something like that. And the other one is much later, circa 2018 or even 19. Yeah.
There are a lot of victims, for lack of a better word, people done wrong in the book, and there are a lot of people I'm going to call villains, people who are cast in the role of hurting or hindering this effort that you and others were involved in. I'm curious, though, about heroes. Are there people who did not comply, who did not turn to euphemism, as you so eloquently put it in the book, who did not do the polite thing and step aside, or retool their organization? Tell me a little bit about some of the heroes. I don't have very many heroes left.
There's so many in education, actually. Um, I'm a little dismayed by the characterizations of villains and heroes. I mean, I hear what you mean, and I did try to write a good story, by the way. So I guess every story needs to have those kinds of elements. But look, I mean, everybody is arriving at this with good intentions, and I also want to say that I am strongly in support of diversity, equity, inclusion. I'm referring to a particular strand of it that I think is harmful. Of course, we should recognize that we are a nation of immigrants. Our schools reflect a great diversity of students with different backgrounds and cultures and heritages, and those should be acknowledged and celebrated and understood. And of course, we want children to feel a strong sense of belonging. And most of all, we want to create true equality of opportunity. So I think everyone in the story is aligned on the purpose. It's really about methods. But as far as heroes are concerned, I think it's the people who stood up to the bullying and the aggression and said, no, I believe in what we're doing and I'm going to keep on doing it. I think the one example, and she's much maligned, but is Eva Moskowitz in New York City. This is a very strong person. And we need more people like that. We really do. We need fighters if we're going to make any progress in really achieving racial equality in this country. And so I think that that's a very strong example. I think Ian Rowe, a Black educator and leader, is another example of someone who has been very courageous and has spoken out for this cause. I really think there are a great many. And then, of course, all the people who are just doing the work in the classroom every day. I think it's little understood that
Right.
teaching is the hardest, most brutal job out there.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that people kept going through this moral panic and then the ensuing pandemic is truly remarkable, because these have been very tough times.
Mm. Well, I'm glad to hear that there's some heroes, and it's interesting to hear that one of their attributes is power of personality or willingness to fight when the stakes are high. My one of my few remaining heroes in the education space is Gina Raimondo, the former Rhode Island governor who got Providence schools open much earlier than the rest,
Yes.
than most other people. But my list of people who did not act particularly heroic, did not fight, is long,
Yeah.
and includes people I knew to be doing admirable things and to be generally good people. Arnie Duncan, John King. These are people who, and I'm obsessed, in case I didn't tell you ahead of time, I'm quite obsessed with the prolonged closure of schools during the pandemic. That's where I was looking for leadership, not silence, not complicity. And that's where I, frankly, in the education community and in the journalism community, didn't see the kind of fortitude that I was looking for.
Can I
This,
just comment on that, Alexander?
sure.
Because I just want to say that that in that period, I think where we really didn't see courage was in insisting that students be able to continue to access a high quality education. And what happened is not just that schools remained closed too long. And on that, I would love to understand more of your point of view. I do think that there was confusion and but not nefarious intent there. The science pointed in various ways, and so on. People can legitimately disagree, and of course, the consequences. Oh, you're laughing at me. Great, this is going to be fun. But I think that the worst problem was the call to quote, and this is a quote, to slow down instruction during the pandemic, to require teachers only to teach for an hour or two a day in live instruction, to suspend all teacher evaluations and observations during this period. This is the way in which the majority education system showed its contempt for the students that it educates, that it would permit this degradation of quality rather than rising to the occasion and saying, nope, we're not stopping. We have a job to do here. We're not advocating. So that to me was the most unconscionable piece. But I want to hear more about your.
No, I think I agree with you. I think the whole endeavor ended up being quite cruel at a very, very large scale.
I could not agree more. And we're going to be paying, children are going to be paying the cost of this for years, if not decades.
And in my ongoing effort to be as unpopular as possible, when my Democratic friends talk about cruelty in the Trump administration or cruelty from conservatives, the famous saying is the cruelty is the point. My urge is to say we committed a great cruelty to an enormous number of kids by closing schools, forcing them away from social and academic supports, and a belief in a safety net, which is expressed through schools to most kids. It makes me enormously angry. And the thing that makes me close to angry about your book is that you don't name names.
On that particular topic or generally?
You don't like the idea of villains. And we all get to go through the world the way that we need to go through the world as we see best. And I'm not interested in name calling, but I read the book and I wanted it to be the cleansing. I wanted it to cleanse the school reform movement. Mm-hmm. And the only way to cleanse is, and you say this about many things, but then I'm not sure that you do it yourself in your writing. The only way to cleanse is to open up all the windows and show everything. And there's an enormous amount of I'm going to call it euphemism in your book about some of the things that the reform community did wrong, and an unwillingness to name some of the people and both hold people accountable for what they've done or not done, and then move things forward. I feel like is there a secret extra chapter to the book where you just take off your shirt and just get at it?
Wow, I haven't heard that one. That's so interesting. So I take that to heart. I would love to understand that better, why you come to that conclusion. I feel like most people have said, oh, wow, you're really taking the gloves off. You're letting it rip here. You're not holding anything back. I didn't want to write I think maybe the most important thing I would say to that is I didn't want to write an angry book, because if I'm just angry, then people will dismiss it. I want to create something, wanted to offer something productive. So while I agree that it's important to open the windows and clean out the room and have an accounting of what happened, I think I disagree with you a little bit, with all respect. I feel like I am quite clear on where I think we went wrong. I place a lot of responsibility on the people like Timo Kuhn and Robin DiAngelo, and those who are the intellectual origins of this. And in that, I think I'm quite unsparing.
No, you're very clear about what those folks did that you considered to be corrosive and unhelpful. And if I were some of them and I saw my name in your book, I'd have some things to say to you about how I was characterized. But when I was on the Hill and people would complain about the other side, I would always say, hey, the other side's going to do what they're going to do. What can we do? What did we do? And I don't see, other than, and I don't even understand the mechanism through which this happened, but other than praising Eva for not having buckled down, bent the knee, to use the language of 2025, to conformity and to reduced expectations. I don't know exactly from this book. I'd love to know here, or maybe there's a chapter I haven't read yet. I'd love to know what allowed her to do that. And I'm also curious about, again, looking in the mirror, what could the urban charter reform leadership community have done differently? Would you not have stood down? Would you have refused to leave? Should someone at KIPP have fallen on their sword? Should Linda Brown have held on to building excellent schools rather than handing it over? I don't see the accountability on the reform side. I see a lot of describing of failings of things done to the reform community, but not what the reform community should have done.
Well, I think that's right. That's a wonderful pushback. I think that the reform community, the funders, and especially the boards of trustees of organizations, should have had more clarity about their purpose and their methods. And when those things are being trampled on, they should have stood up to their values and commitments and pushed back and said, no, we're not going there. Instead, there was a tremendous amount of fecklessness. And I think that that is very much at fault. I think also there's no question that the reform community was far too late in ensuring that there were equal promotional paths within their organizations for people of color. Too often, I do talk about this in the book, deans of students were appointed from the ranks of Black and Latino teachers, and deans of instruction from white teachers. And that became a pronounced pattern. It's clearly unacceptable. It's indefensible. I think that was a major failing. I think the boards of these organizations were not sufficiently diversified, including my own. And so those are very significant failings. I think that they were excesses of the disciplinary practices. There was a fetishization of small things in the spirit of the sweat the small stuff so we don't have to sweat the big stuff, and that was taken too far. Look, they were real failures, but there were also significant responses to that. These were organizations that had a tremendous curiosity about what they were doing. They were very interested in learning from other ones like themselves that were doing things better. There was humility to these places, and they did make adjustments. So at Ascend, as I talk about in the book, we made real pivots on both the curriculum and our disciplinary practice, and I'm really proud that we made those. But I think the biggest problem is that we didn't stand up for what we believed in, and I think that was a mistake. So I think it was a failure of clarity of purpose. So when I talk about someone like Eva, yes, I respect and admire her clarity of purpose, her willingness to take the heat, her willingness to push back against her critics when she thinks that they're wrong. I do think we need more people like that. Simply playing nice and aiming for comity is not the solution in education.
Thank you so much for talking to me and for tolerating my questions and my intensity. I really do appreciate it.
No, I loved it. I'm so glad. I wish we had another 3 hours.
I wanted to know what happens next with the book. We'll get this podcast up as soon as we can. Are there events people could consider attending? Are there future bookings or bigger media appearances that might be happening. What's next for the book and for you?
Well, I think there are more podcasts of diverse hosts with different points of view. I'm trying to get opportunities across the ideological spectrum. I think part of what's going on here is we're such a polarized country, and we have to be able to encounter people who don't think like us. So that's what I'm hoping I can, in a small way, promote within the education field. So on our site, thelostdecade.org, if you go to that, you'll see a listing of future events and media coverage and so on. And I hope people will visit that.
I think there's a real opportunity here, a hunger to figure out A, what happened, and then B, where do we go forward. There's been an enormous reluctance and a lot of private conversation. But
exactly.
I feel like there's an opportunity here for constructive reconsideration, and I think this book is an important part of that. I'm very, very optimistic because of the reception a couple of books recently have gotten. Two Princeton authors wrote a book about COVID that got on the New York Times, the Daily Podcast, which I never would have thought would have happened. David Zweig, who wrote about the school closures during COVID, got on Jake Tapper over the weekend and has been in a couple of other places. I feel like there's a hunger for reckoning, reconsideration, et cetera, and certainly a need. And I feel like The Lost Decade can be, could be, should be a real core part of that.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's exactly what we need. We need to have the conversation in public that we've been having in private to make progress.
Stephen Wilson, author of the book, The Lost Decade. Thank you so much for talking to me. I'm Alexander Russo with The Grade. Thanks to everyone who's watched. And please look at the show notes for Stephen's websites and information about where you can see him talk or read his thoughts about what happened over these past 10 years. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, too.